It's now time to take a look at news stories making headlines around the globe. Of course, we begin here at home, as Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu has reaffirmed his commitment to the welfare and dignity of the armed forces as the country marks Armed Forces Remembrance and Celebration Day. In a personally signed message posted on X from Abu Dhabi, the president paid tribute to fallen soldiers who, he said, sacrificed everything for the nation's freedom and peace. He said while their names may not always be remembered, their courage continues to sustain the nation, warning that a country which forgets its fallen heroes risks losing its direction. President Tinubu also addressed the families of the fallen widows, children and loved ones, describing their loss as profound and assuring them that Nigeria will not forget their sacrifice. He praised serving personnel across land, sea and air for defending the country with discipline and professionalism, often far from home, adding that as Commander-in-Chief, a secure Nigeria stands behind them and will continue to support them in action. Well, Nigeria marked the 2026 Armed Forces Celebration and Remembrance Day amid military reports of recent gains against armed groups in parts of the country, even as insecurity persists elsewhere. In Abuja, Vice President Kashim Shettima represented President Bola Tinubu, who is abroad, as officials, veterans and military families paused to reflect on sacrifice, service and the nation's debt to those who defend it. State House correspondent Adesua Omorwan reports.
Colorful yet solemn. Nigeria's Armed Forces Celebration and Remembrance Day honors fallen soldiers from past wars to today's fight against terrorism, while recognizing veterans and their families. Dignitaries, government officials, and service chiefs arrive in a formal procession. The arrival of Vice President Kashim Shettima, representing President Bola Tinubu, marks the formal commencement of the ceremony. He takes the salute and inspects the guard of honor. Prayers are then offered by Muslim and Christian clerics, followed by a minute of silence. The Vice President then leads the laying of wreaths at the tomb of the unknown soldier, paying tribute to those who sacrificed their lives defending Nigeria's security. The firing party delivers 3 volleys, followed by the release of pigeons, a symbol of peace, bringing the ceremonial proceedings to a close. For the Minister of Defense, the occasion is deeply personal. Last year, he attended in uniform as Chief of Defense Staff. This year, he comes in civilian capacity, overseeing the armed forces from the political helm.
It's exciting, a new challenge, and I think what the armed forces have done for us is that it prepares you for whatever. So this is part of it, and then we will take up the responsibilities and continue with it. So I want to thank Nigerians for the support to the armed forces and to continue to make them understand that the challenges we are facing is surmountable. We're working together as a team, as Nigerians, and that's what we pray for.
Lawmakers say the remembrance must be matched with support for troops.
We are proud of what the president is doing about the welfare of the men in service. It can only get better. With time, it will keep improving because security is on the front burner, and as Parliament, we are not going to look at anything else but improving the budget where need be to ensure that all that the military, the armed forces need, that they have them.
For those representing veterans and families of fallen soldiers, the message is directed to troops still in harm's way.
Today made us to remember the fallen heroes and those ones still serving. I said those ones still serving, they should have hope and have assurance that after the service, something good is waiting for them.
Military families, often described as the silent casualties of conflict, were also acknowledged. The wife of the Chief of Defense Staff, who also chairs the Defense and Police Officers' Wives Association, says concerns of welfare are being addressed.
Many women have not just lost their husbands, some have even those whose husbands are alive. have had to raise the families alone. There's a lot of sacrifice that has been paid by military families, and I want to say to them that we as the leaders see you, we hear you, and I believe that Nigerians are gradually beginning to understand the level of sacrifice that is made by the military community.
Wreaths have been laid, prayers offered, and the last post sounded here in Abuja, bringing to a close Nigeria's Armed Forces celebration and Remembrance Day for 2026. But beyond the ceremony, today is a reminder of the cost of the country's many security battles and the men and women who continue to serve on multiple fronts. From the arcade at the 3 Armed Zone in Abuja, Adesua Omoran, Arise News.
Thank you for that awesome report, Adesua. Now, Abba Abubakar, son of former Vice President and 2023 People's Democratic Party presidential candidate Atiku Abubakar, has defected from the PDP to the ruling All Progressives Congress, pledging to work for the re-election of President Bola Tinubu in 2027. The defection was announced on Thursday at the National Assembly, Abuja. Popularly known as Abba, the younger Atiku was formally received by the Deputy President of the Senate, Senator Barau Jibrin, alongside key APC leaders from the Northeast geopolitical zone, in what party leaders described as a significant political realignment. In the meantime, the former Vice President has addressed his son, Abba Abubakar's decision to join the All Progressives Congress, describing it as a personal choice. Well, let's shift our attention to the economy, as Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Wale Edun, has announced that the federal government achieved 85% performance in capital expenditure in the 2024 fiscal year, underscoring what it described as improved budget execution and stronger public finance management. Edun disclosed this yesterday in Lagos at the launch of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, NESG 2026 Macroeconomic Outlook. Speaking on the budget, Edun said the outcome followed the extension of the 2024 budget implementation period, which allowed the government to complete critical projects rather than abandon them midstream. The federal government also defended Nigeria's rising public debt stock of about 152 trillion naira, insisting that the increase largely reflects improved transparency and exchange rate adjustments rather than reckless new borrowing. Edun stressed that although debt service remains a challenge, transparency has improved significantly, adding that the government has continued to meet all its statutory obligations. Meanwhile, the National Bureau of Statistics says Nigeria's headline inflation rate stood at 15.15% in December 2025, with the consumer price index rising to 131.2 points under the newly rebased framework using 2024 as the base year. Now, the federal government has assured the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria that the proposed tax reforms are aimed at introducing a single-digit tax regime to ease the burden of multiple taxation on businesses and citizens. Chairman, Presidential Committee on Fiscal and Tax Reforms, Taiwo Oyedele, gave the assurance while engaging stakeholders in the Nigerian manufacturing sector in Lagos. He disclosed that before the Harmonized Tax Initiative, some states imposed between 60 and 197 different taxes and levies. Speaking on the theme from legislative assembly to factory floor, what the new tax laws mean for Nigerian manufacturers, Oyedele said the reforms would significantly reduce the overall tax burden while ensuring sustainable revenue generation for the government. President of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, Francis Meshioye, and Director General of MAN, Segun Ajayi Kadiri, urged state governments to fast-track the passage of the harmonized tax law in the interest of manufacturers and Nigerians at large.
It's for states to enact for themselves the taxes that they believe they should collect in line with the Constitution. So what we have done is we have worked with the Joint Revenue Board, which is all the states are represented in that board. So we work with them and develop what we call harmonized tax law for states. We sent it to the states for them to enact for themselves, and there has been very impressive progress that we have seen. I haven't seen this kind of progress in my adult life for something that's difficult but important. from Ekiti State to Anambra State to Zamfara State, Kano, Kwara, I was just told this morning. So the states are passing these laws to say no more multiple taxation. All these taxes that they collect from us all over the place are being outlawed. Part of the requirement of this new law is that nobody can collect taxes by putting a roadblock. You put wood on the road with nails. Some of them even physically assault people to collect tax.
One of the things that is obvious in any good tax law is not just to really impose taxes, it's to do a win-win. Okay, if you create an enabler, have an enabler that makes us to do more business, then definitely you're going to get tax on those businesses that you do. So you get much more money on the larger volume of business that you do than getting higher percentage or whatever money you want to get on each business. So by having a business environment that really creates value addition, grow businesses, then definitely the multiple effects on the government will be much more. For instance, employment. If more employment is generated, then there'll be a lot of pay. And if the business environment is more good, more business should be there, more utilities should be paid, and so many other things, not from the manufacturer itself, but by the service provider and other people's tools.
Those who use untoward means of collecting tax with nail spikes and even shutting your doors and closing your factories. All those ones will soon be a thing of the past, in the sense that those mostly originate from the subnationals, the states and the local governments. And now that the states on their own are passing these laws, it is evident that we are making progress. You will recall that because it's a constitutional matter, it's not possible for the federal government to dictate to the subnationals. So now that we are seeing full alignment and voluntary passage of those laws, it bodes well for the reform, because the reform will be meaningless if we do not have an alignment with those subnationals.
All right, now from issues around taxation, we now shift our attention to issues around governance. As on the 60th anniversary of Nigeria's first coup, a new book which highlights the lasting effects of military rule on the country has been unveiled, with eminent Nigerians calling for a new constitution to address some of the imbalances created over the years. Authored by a chieftain of the National Democratic Coalition, NADECO, that's Ayo Opadokun, the book, The Gun Hegemony, critically examines how military intervention disrupted Nigeria's constitutional order and derailed its democratic development. Arise News chief correspondent Tokumbo Oyetunji has the details.
It's been 60 years since Nigeria's first military coup and the subsequent ones that left far-reaching consequences on the country's politics and social stability.
We would come to understand why we should do everything.
Those effects, especially as they relate to its federalism and constitutional order, are the topic of focus in this room, where a new book, The Gun Hegemony, authored by lawyer and democracy activist Ayo Opadokun, is being unveiled. Expectedly, there are reflections on Nigeria's progress before the military intervention, which would later alter its course significantly.
Many of us who are over 60 know that there was life in this country before the gun hegemony. There was a time, actually, that we had 3 high commissioners in Britain. That was when you would call Nigeria a true federalism. But since the gun hegemony, all that has changed.
Then Nigeria was a progressive country. The premiers of the 4 regions that we had were developing their region. But all that story has changed since the military intervened in politics and in governance of our country. So I have been, since I retired and relocated back in Nigeria in 2000, a strong advocate of a new constitution, a new truly federal constitution for Nigeria.
The gun hegemony interrogates the suspension of the negotiated independence constitution and its replacement with a unitary model that still troubles the country till date.
It does well to probe the origins of guns and how it changed forever the tone and tone of warfare over the ages. But the concern of the author is how the gun has changed the Nigerian narrative forever. He laments how we missed the opportunity in January 1966. In doing so, he has excavated some facts that were known to a few, and even those who knew did not insist on the veracity of their witnesses.
It is pertinent to note that Chief Opadoko's submissions in this book are not merely theoretical. They are grounded in Chief Opadoko's practical knowledge, experience, and understanding of Nigeria's political history, especially the many attempts through the years to wrest power from the soldiers and restore civil rule in the country.
The author metaphorically argues that Nigeria is a creation of the gun, with its growth arrested by the colonialist established Nigerian army originally set up for the subjugation and domination of citizens, and that after independence, that institution only tolerated the country's civil leadership for a few years before its men struck in January 1966.
Where would Nigeria have been today without the January 15, 1966 military coup? See, what are the impact of the military dictatorship on the country's socio-economic, political, social services, infrastructure, and public institutions, like the police and the Nigerian army itself? Why has Nigeria lost a cherished national ethos, value system, standards, rules of engagement? And why has Nigeria remained an underdeveloping country, while a number of those countries with which we were relatively at par at our political independence in 1960 have become developed countries?
His argument is that the damage caused by that long interregnum cannot be hurriedly corrected. And as the book reviewer aptly puts it, Opadokun's gun hegemony is a meditation on a nation's dark moments, and he nudges us to look back again on that day, this day, to understand how to treasure the beauty of democracy. Tokumbo Oyetunji, Arise News, Lagos.
All right, pertinent conversations happening around nation building, along with some news from the economic sector. And of course, we continue to discuss and commemorate and celebrate Armed Forces Remembrance Day.
So I think the book coming out at this time by Chief Opadoku is very apt, because we have not really learned a lot of lessons from what happened around 66. You know, if you talk to some people, they'll break Nigeria's history into two areas, before the war and after the war. That's what they'll always tell you. And I still see a lot of those centripetal forces that was around that time still in existence today, and that's where the problem lies. So if you look at the political class then, if Chief Opadoku says, yes, let's blame the military, but what about the political class then? You forget that it was around that time we had what we call the wetie. Wetie pretty much means put petrol on people's homes. You get, and they burnt the homes because they were political adversaries. That was when you had the big fight between Awolowo and Akitola, and the western region was called the Wild Wild West. When Akitola went to demo, Bori demo ni mowa. I mean, those were the political narratives then. And that fight raged on for a very long while. Pretty much replica of what you're seeing today in Rivers State. And you had that. And the boys and the military guys in the back were looking and saying, very young and idealistic, were looking and saying, Are we going to leave the country in the hands of these politicians? And then you had back and forth everywhere. Leading up to the elections, 65, that was a total chaos. Rigging at the highest order. Anyway, the 59 elections, I think that was done on the 12th of December 1959, the British had already imposed who they wanted there. They knew it was going to be a hung parliament, but they had done a lot of gerrymandering, so anybody that emerged between the NCSC would definitely form a government with the MPC. So we had all of that. Then leading up to this, then we had the Wild Wild West, then we had the elections, and this was what led the guys like Ifejuna. I mean, look at the guys like Ifejuna. Had done so well for Nigeria, had participated in athletic championship and the likes. Commonwealth Games, done very well. Ademoyega and the likes. But they also made a mistake, because the mistake was the coup, thinking that, oh, in their idealistic mind, that was the solution to the problem. It was not violence. And when they plotted and they had the coup, for further reading, you can read why it was struck. When they had the coup, they forgot that the centripetal political forces that were there on ground, the politicians were going to use it against them. And that was what the politicians did. Oh, you killed somebody from this region. You let somebody leave from this region. You didn't prosecute those. I'm sure if the likes of them, Kaduna and Zego, understood the importance of some of his actions then, and as his name implies, Kaduna was from Okpanam. He had not even stayed in Okpanam any part of his life. He stayed in the north. But if he understood the implications of leading the battalion to go killing the Saldana, I'm sure he would not have done it, because the political forces were still there. And that was what led to the breakback. So you had a bunch of very corrupt politicians like we had today, and you had a bunch of very idealistic military guys. And both of those scenarios don't mix. And that was the problem. Until today, we are still suffering it. And that's why when people talk about coup, it's never the solution. The solution is calling to accountability this bunch of very corrupt politicians. Then if you hear the words of Kaduna Nzego, he was talking about the 10%ers. Today, they don't collect 10% on contracts again. They collect over 50, 60 people. They don't even get the contract done. But the guys then did not know that all of this was just going to play into their hands. And guess what? They politicized it. And when, the likes of Ayo Okpadokun keep talking about military, Chief Ayo Okpadokun, the one point, I've not read the book, but I hope you should make it in that book, is the role the politicians still play in all military regimes. Do you think the decision-making process by the military was totally the military? Do you know the role the politicians play? Read Babangida's memoirs and see the role politicians play, how he revealed most of them. They were the ones that were going forward and backward. They were the ones that were pacifying Abiola at the back during June 12. They were the ones that was going to say Babangida no gree. So when you look at the bulk of the problem, it's still our politicians. But the question is, I hope we learn lessons 60 years after. And those are the conversations we need to have. So I think for further reading to this conversation, I would say let's read some books. Philip Effiong wrote a book, I think something about the cage bird experience. Elechi Amadi wrote a book about sunset in Biafra. From you can read some Masolion and the likes, You can read some Frederick Forsyth, but I think very, very slanted. But for me, when it comes to things about 60s, one of the most balanced accounts is still John the Jore's book. That talks about the Civil War. So it's very balanced. There are many accounts here and there. You can Forsyth and the like, but that's a very balanced account. And I hope we do learn from this, because our life is still around what happened in the Civil War.
Okay. Let me start with Mr. Ayo Okpadokun's book, which is titled The Gun Hegemony. Mr. Ayo Okpadokun is a lawyer. He's a pro-democracy activist, one of the leaders of NADECO. And I consider his book, The Gun Hegemony, a major contribution to the literature. It's not even emerging literature, it's an emergent literature on what happened January 15, 1966. I spoke about the significance of January 15 in Nigerian history yesterday, where I linked it to the coup of January 15, 1966, the counter coup of July 28, 1966, and the subsequent civil war when things became no longer at ease, as Chino Achebe pointed out. And then, of course, the act of surrender on January 15, 1970. We have had many books already on this particular incident of January 15, 1966, which is to show how it was a life-changing, transformative, catalytic event in the history of Nigeria, marking the first time the military intervened in political governance in Nigeria. And so you have had some of the persons involved in the coup while we struck by Adewale Ademoyega. Bengulie has also written his own book. Alexander Madiebo has also written a book on the subject. So many others have written. Even before now, I think General Chris Ali wrote a book trying to assess the role of the military in Nigerian politics, titled The Federal Republic of the Nigerian Armed Forces. All these, are relevant books on this specific event. And now you have this book by Mr. Okpadokun. Now, the reviewer was Professor Sylvester Odion Akaine. I've gone through his review. He says the book contains 15 chapters. And what the book does, essentially, as Professor Akaine has pointed out in his review, is to talk about Nigeria before the military intervened, what led to the military intervention, and then, of course, how the military played a role in Nigerian politics thereafter. Well, many people have divided opinions about what the military did. There are some people who said, the military rule derailed Nigeria. But there are some people who have also been sympathetic to military intervention in Nigeria. Don't forget that within the 70s to the early 80s, there was this thing in political science in Africa about the strongman, orientation, strongman politics. That for Africa to develop, you need strong men. But of course, by the 90s, that was already beginning to change. So it's also important, theoretically, that you put it in context. But the major focus of the book by Chief Mr. Ayo Okpadokun is about the impact of military rule and even impact on the media. Because in chapter 12 of that book, as Professor Akaine pointed out, there was a review of the role of even the media in the whole of that process. Well, I know the media gets blamed for everything, but we have been here in the Nigerian context since 1859, and we continue to play our role as a crusading, courageous, fourth estate of the realm. However, I think what is important is the manner in which Mr. Ayo Okpadokun has, reinvented the conversation about the role of the military. And on that occasion, two of the prominent Nigerians who were there, the Ichie Adazie of Ubosi, former Commonwealth Secretary General, Chief Emeka Anyauku, and the doyen of the Nigerian media, Mr. Sam Amuka Kwemo, Uncle Sam, they raised issues about federalism and democracy. Very important subjects, unending subjects in the Nigerian, conversation. And the issue is, okay, the military left to even interrogate the problem. How have the civilians, the Democrats, who have been in charge since 1999, how have they fared? I think that should also be part of the conversation. Are we better now under civilian rule than we were under the military? Is the military still a factor? Because when you raise key questions, they will say, there are some rulers of Nigeria. When you look at the list of the rulers of Nigeria, there are still military leaders who will assert that they have transformed from khaki to civilian garb.
So all these are related questions. But that moment in Nigerian history was, a major turning point for Nigeria. That is that about that. You talked about Abba Abubakar, the son of Waziri Adamawa Atiku Abubakar, joining the APC, moving from the PDP to the APC, having been inspired, he himself says, by Senator Barau Jibrin, the Senate Deputy President. Well, this is not the first time this will happen. Father and son belonging to different political parties. In the federal elections of March 1957, we had Alvan Ikuku. Alvan Ikuku was a major educationist. It's his face you will see on the 10 naira note. He belonged to a party different from that of his son. He was in the United National Independence Party, UNIP. He wanted a position in the Eastern House Regional Assembly. His son, Samuel Gumsu Ikoku, was a member of the Action Group. Father and son went to contest for the same position, which is not the case right now. But the son defeated the father and later became the leader of the opposition in Eastern Region House of Assembly. And I think this is what Atiku Abubakar, Waziri Adamawa, was referring to when he said, well, he doesn't dictate to his children and that it is his personal choice. He has the right as a citizen of the Federal Republic to belong to a political party of his choice. That he, as Atiku Abubakar, is just worried about the poverty in the land and how to give Nigerians good governance, and that is not forcing Nigerians even in that regard. I think, those were very instructive points that he made. You still see father and son, husband and wife belonging to different political parties. In a democracy, that I think is allowed. In fact, Abba Abubakar went for that by changing the name of his political platform, Aske Atiku Organization, to Aske Bola Tinubu Organization. I'm sure that President Tinubu and members of APC would gladly welcome him. Now, there was another issue. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu sending a message from Dubai, the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, which is attending, to say, his government is committed to the welfare and that, of those who sacrifice their lives so that Nigeria could continue to survive and all of us can continue to feel safe, and that the welfare of their widows, the orphans, of fallen heroes will be taken seriously. Well, good messaging, sounds very, very nice. And then commendation for the troops by all the persons who spoke, governors, opposition, and all that. Now, with welfare, the major takeaway from President Tinubu's point, when we were discussing yesterday the issue about whether Armed Forces Remembrance Day should be a national holiday, I said, no, we have too many holidays in this country. But the point about welfare, which President Tinubu stressed, is very important. What it means is that the soldiers who are still alive, who are on the war front, whether in Sambisa or anywhere else fighting terrorists, must be well taken care of. Heroes that are falling, their families should be properly treated. Those who are retired, they must get their allowances on a regular basis. That is when we will know that the president means very well when he says this is what we're going to do. Finally, the Minister of Finance, Wale Edun, says, well, budget performance is very good, 2024 performance, fiscal, financial obligations being met and all of that. Very encouraging. But the point that I see here is about IMF. The IMF chief, resident representative in Nigeria, was saying that for this to be sustained, the Nigerian government must continue with its reforms, which, it's a part of reform and all of that. However, this thing about inflation, which they say is now 15.15% as of December, is based on some kind of, creativity. They say rebasing. Methodology has been changed. Now the IMF resident rep is saying, well, this rebasing, this new methodology will translate into concrete benefits in terms of the cost of living for Nigerians. Well, inflation has been going down according to the Bureau of Statistics consecutively. We have not yet seen the effect, the evidence in terms of the cost of living. The economists, those who know the subjects, they say, okay, it takes time. It's taking too long a time. When we begin to see the effect and food inflation comes down, that's when we will believe that this CPI is having an effect. And that's why I think the Manufacturers Association are also very concerned.
Right. One quick point. I just wanted to make a reference because when I talked about the British gerrymandering in the 59 elections, for further reading on that, you can read the Harold Smith story. Harold Smith was a British, civil servant in Nigeria, and he talked about how the British gerrymandered the elections to favor some people.
He was talking about British conspiracy.
Conspiracy.
And it was, an officer who was involved in the Nigerian process at that time. Yeah. And when the book came out, it was very embarrassing, to the British scholars that, in fact, the British were responsible for the way the hegemony, the gun hegemony that Ayo Okpadokun talks about, in Nigerian history.
And I'm glad you made this point because I think that's the angle that I'd want us to bring in just very briefly on issues around gun hegemony is that I think there's a debate that needs to be had about whether this hegemony belongs to the military era or to the colonial era. Because I know there's scholars like J.F. Ade Ajayi of the Ibadan School of Thought who feel that colonialism, School of History, who say that colonialism was just an episode and not a definitive era in Nigeria's history. So there's a lot to unpack because, of course, the other school of thought is saying, well, the military era was the definitive period. And the argument in this is that both eras represented a raw form of power and made raw power political currency, and which has evolved into what we see around Machiavellian politics today. So I think each era of history has some takeaways that need to be studied in order for us to be able to reform where we are today. But I quickly move on to touch on Remembrance, Armed Forces Remembrance Day, and the President's message from Abu Dhabi, which I just want to highlight that his absence was felt. His absence was felt because last year we lost Brigadier General Musa Uba. In 2021, we lost Brigadier General Jama Zirkusu. Now, I make reference to these, even though between 2019 and 2025, we've lost over 450 soldiers to military operations against insurgency and terrorism in Nigeria. But these are high-ranking officials. And when you have high-ranking soldiers being lost on the battlefield to the current fight against insecurity and insurgency, the presence of the commander-in-chief goes a long way in pushing a reassuring message around the fact that he does stand not just with the armed forces itself, but with the families of the departed. Because the wife of Brigadier General Musa Uba continues to say that she's still waiting for a real explanation as to what really could have transpired with the issue of the ambush against her that killed her husband, that was manifest through him trying to appeal over WhatsApp to his task force in Borno State for assistance. So just a quick word on that, which is that I think it was important that during the current intensified fight that we're engaged in, the commander-in-chief should have been present. Now, let's quickly move on to the defection of Abba Abubakar from the PDP to the APC. Well, I think at the moment, the biggest question is, what is the electoral value of it? The optics are great. The headlines are great. APC have had an opportunity to issue some press releases and, use this to gain a bit of political mileage and some talking points against the potential contender for the presidential ticket for the ADC, being Atiku Abubakar. But when you look at what happened in the Northeast in 2023, Atiku Abubakar won that election, but just by about 600,000 votes. So that is quite a slim margin, in my opinion, given the fact that that is supposed to have been his stronghold, if I put it that way. He got over 1.7 million votes, whereas Bola Tinubu got about 1.1 million votes, representing 50% of the vote and 34% of the vote, respectively. Now, does this young man represent any electoral value to be able to push those numbers? Highly unlikely. But I think it also signals a direction in engaging further and engaging more deeply with the Northeast and making inroads to seeing how those numbers can be moved forward, especially if we're going to see an Atiku Abubakar or an Atiku Abubakar-backed ticket for the ADC. So those are some of the permutations that we're seeing movement in that region. Very quickly to the economy. So we're saying 85% budget performance for 2024. We're saying 15.15% inflation for December 2025. What is behind the headline? What is behind the headline is that this budget performance that we're attributing to 2024 is a budget performance that has been stretched. So if I give you money and I tell you to perform in a certain period of time and you're unable to do it, and I extend that period of time for you to be able to do it, surely your performance rate is going to increase. Now, if you look at the inflation number has been changed. As opposed to us basing on the month of December 2024, which analysts had said would have resulted in about a 30% interest rate. We have now, inflation rate. We've now said, no. Let's harmonize, let's create a 12-month period as our reference point, which can give us a more tempered inflation rate. So what are we doing here? What we're doing is we're creating statistics that are palatable, that are sellable, that are good for PR and marketing. But my concern is that, yes, the PR, the messaging, the signaling is important. My concern is behind the scenes as we are planning our budgets and we are having these meetings. I hope we're looking at the real raw numbers, not the ones that are palatable. Yes, several countries do use the 12-month reference versus the 1-month reference, but the difference is that the 1-month reference will give you a better snapshot of shocks to prices, whereas the 12-month gives you a more tempered, a more palatable, a more, friendly inflation rate. I close by saying with 85% budget performance, 1.8 trillion naira has been allocated in the 2026 budget to pay outstanding debts to contractors from that same 2024 budget cycle. So 85% may be a nice figure for us to engage with the IMF. But the reality is that 1.8 trillion naira for 2026 is still going to contractors to finish up 2024.